by telling you about last weekend. But to do that, I have to go back about 160 years. So 160 years ago in Sweden, a little girl was born. Her dad was a naval commander. They lived outside Stockholm. And she very quickly showed an aptitude and an interest in nature, two things, nature and art. And as she grew up, she had a fairly standard response to that. Her parents supported her in her pursuits. She went to the Royal Academy of Art. She very quickly became one of the better received landscape painters from her class and got a studio. And then this is what she painted. And it's lovely. It's a nice painting. You could really enjoy a lot of things about this. And she did that for quite some time. And around the age of 40, one could say her life took a little bit of a surreal turn. She started to recognize that there were different things that she was seeing and feeling drawn to, that there were different ways of seeing things in the world than she had been taught, and that she had a very deep desire to explore and communicate those things in ways that at that time no one around her was doing. And so about the age of 44, in 1906, she started painting things that looked like this. Now this is 20 years before Surrealism. It's 30 years before we recognized abstract expressionism as a thing. She painted this entire body of work before Kandinsky ever even ventured into the idea of more expressive, and that's of more expressive painting. And that's something that is, I don't think we can underestimate, or overestimate, I guess, how big of a shift that is. For eons, people painted and created art with the express purpose of representing what can physically be seen in the world around you, and doing it with like such faithfulness and such fidelity to that image that that was considered art. That was considered fine art. And so for someone who was trained in that, and for someone who was who grew up in that, to take, I don't understand how someone actually has the capacity to take a leap of this magnitude. And these paintings here are part of a body of work that ultimately ended up taking place over about 9 years, but each of these paintings, they're 10 feet tall. So we're talking, they are larger than life. And these were created over the course of 4 days each. So she started to, there were a lot of aspects of what went into her work. Oh, her name's Hilma, by the way. I'm getting to that. But, so she actually created these things literally with no other impulse than just that she felt drawn to create it and was engaging with what she felt and saw around her in a totally different way. And there were aspects of the spiritual in what was drawing her to that. There were aspects of the natural world. There was an intense synthesis that was taking place that is at the heart, I think, of any new way of seeing the world, is an intense synthesis that brings together things that haven't been brought together before. And the rest of this body of work, so like I said, it ended up becoming about a body of about 200 paintings. And as she's creating them, she's not showing these to anyone. This is completely her own world. This is completely something that she is seeking to understand. And that's one of the qualities of her work that is so compelling to this day, is you can sense, almost on a physical level, the intense desire to understand something and connect with something that's profound and beyond what's readily available, beyond what's readily accepted or understood. And this body of work ended up being called the Paintings for the Temple. And it's really interesting, because the moment you hear Paintings for the Temple, I think it's very easy, we even have really accepted understanding of what that means, that there's a religious context, or that there are different, she didn't know what that meant, really. This was something that was unfolding. They were called this, they were definitely under a decree of sorts that had a spiritual nature, but they weren't tied to anything. They weren't tied to any thought form or religious perspective that existed at the time. And so when she started to kind of venture outside of her immediate surroundings and the immediate people that were part of her creating this work, she did venture to show it to one person. And it's really interesting, because I actually think it might be the first that I know of documented incident of mansplaining. So she showed this person who arguably could have been her mentor, was interested in very similar things as she was. His name was Rudolf Steiner. He actually was behind, I don't know if you've heard like the Waldorf method with learning. He was behind a whole philosophical school of thought. Anyway, she felt a connection to him and a connection to his thinking, and actually went to the point of having him come and visit her studio. And when he did, we don't know why. Well, obviously, that's kind of lost history, and particularly she kept very detailed journals with regard to her work, but didn't say much about her personal life. So we don't actually know the details of what went down, but we do know that he essentially communicated to her that this was not work that this wasn't work that was understandable or that was going to be accepted or received, and actually kind of pointed to a flaw in her thinking of being too open to, that she needed to look within, almost in a Freudian way, she needed to look at her own thinking and relate it to her own self and her own life, and basically then proceeded to tell her what several of her paintings meant to him, which is what it should mean, of course, to the world. So anyway, it was a really interesting encounter, and after this, you could have taken that a lot of different ways. So she could have gone a lot of different ways. There could have been kind of a martyr, I'm not understood, this is never going, and one of the things I find the most fascinating about her is that wasn't, she just kept doing what she wanted to do. And yet, she took an additional step, which was she started documenting and preparing this work for someone, not knowing who that was at the time. Clearly not having any acceptance or support, even from the fringe people that she thought would be possibly her avenue into integrating with the world. So this is actually, this is her. So I love this picture of her, because she literally, holding that palette, I think she looks like Joan of Arc. And I think she has such an intent and a purpose that's so fascinating to me. And this was how she described how these paintings came to be. And the words that she uses, I think, are really interesting. It was great force without her understanding. And I think that it takes a very unique willingness to be open to the world to participate with something like that. To not have the immediate reaction that this is going to reflect you, or that this is how someone else is going to perceive it. Just that transactional nature of creation, honestly, it's really hard to break out of that. I think that even when you are drawn to understand things in a profound way, it's almost impossible not to think, what does this say about me, and what is someone else going to say about it? And that, I think, that radical openness that she had to really embracing this perspective created something that I think is, I would say, in my experience, singular in the aspect of modern art. But it's interesting. So this is a journal. She kept these journals pretty assiduously, and she started to use this symbol. And I think this symbol is fascinating. I'm a little bit obsessed with it. And the Swedish underneath it says, anything in my collection that bears this mark shouldn't be shown until 20 years after my death. So she started putting this mark on various work, and she started packaging it and indexing it. She has a whole language that's represented in her art that she's created a dictionary for, honestly. Why? Why? And so she left all of her work. So by the end of her life, this intense period of the works for the temple, the paintings for the temple, was about a 9-year period. And after that, this intense influence, otherworldly influence, shifted and changed, and her work changed as in reflection to that. But by the end of her life, she had 1,200 paintings that she created, she packaged, she prepared. They weren't just left oh, nobody liked these, so this is what I'm just the detritus I left in the world. It was actually prepared as if you would be preparing it to send to a museum. And she left it to her great-grandnephew, and with basically the instructions that it was under his caretaking, but that nothing that had that mark should be shown until 20 years after her death. So this is a really interesting conundrum. What drives someone to first see, second create, and third be willing to share despite having zero indicator in an external way that has any place in the world? And I think that has a really interesting aspect to the next part, which is where the surreal meets me. One of the things that she talked about, so she did do some ruminating on what the temple was. She had visions in her mind of where these things would be displayed, how it would work, how the physicality of what she experienced and what she created would be translated into the physical. And it's interesting because in her journal, she has this back and forth of, I see this thing, but is this something that I'm supposed to create? Is this something, what is this? And so, but she would do studies. This was a study that she did of this spiral, and the way she described the temple was not connected to any kind of religious thing. It was a place of introspection and a place of connection. And that in her description, people walking and being able to actually physically move through, and the spiral has a huge influence in a lot of her different pieces, that was the way that she thought that it should be shown in the world. And she actually went so far as to have somebody donated some land, and they actually started considering, okay, are we physically going to build this thing? And it never came to be, which would be easy to think like, oh, it's a bust, like there's no like failure, like that didn't work. But no. So this is where I spent last Saturday. And I can tell you it's uncanny and surreal. I stumbled across her work several years ago and immediately became just captivated by it, but only had access to see it in a couple of books that had been created. Her work had been shown a couple of times in Europe, and that was it, ever. And so I bought those books, I had been interacting with it, and then turns out the Guggenheim did the first major international exhibition of her work, and that's happening right now. And I find it fascinating that literally I was walking through her temple. And she didn't create it. It wasn't created for over 100 years after she thought it up. And yet it's just as real. I mean, it literally is, it's a literal translation of what she saw and what she experienced, which is another interesting conundrum. Sometimes to be able to actually have the vision of what's real meet up in a place where everybody can acknowledge it, it's asynchronous. Time does not actually have the final say. And I think that is one of the other things that fascinates me the most about her, is she was willing to play in that space. And I don't think that there are too many people that I can think of that have done it with that degree of, I think courage is the right word, with that degree of courage and intent around it. So being here this last Saturday, I'd seen her work, I'd obviously seen a lot of the paintings that were on display, but there was a very real physical component to this work that couldn't have been experienced if it hadn't been experienced in a physical setting like this. And I found it changing my whole perspective about where we meet, why we meet, what are the capacities of connection, what are the capacities of collectively creating a vision of what's real together. Because honestly, there's a lot of different versions of what's real, and there's a lot of different ways to play with that. And throughout history, we've most traditionally acknowledged what's real as who has the microphone, I guess I have the microphone right now, but whoever has the ability to say what that is. And I found it really interesting. So I think that's if you were on like Family Feud and somebody said, okay, what are the 5 words for surreal? That would probably be like top vote getter. You'd think that would be the best one. And I think that that's true. And weird is a really interesting word because there's a lot of connotation with it. I think in recent years we've leaned into weird being a good thing a little bit more. But it's also something that kind of scares us and something that kind of we're unsure about. And it was interesting because some social scientists about 8 years ago did a study they redefined what weird actually means. And they used it in kind of a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek way. So they said that basically, if we look back at the core of psychology, the core of behavioral sciences, the core of everything that's emerged, which is also about a 100-year process that this has been happening in, pretty much everything that we know that we have said these are humans are coming from a singular perspective and a singular voice. And they use WEIRD as an acronym for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, which is kind of interesting to think about pretty much anything that surrounds you that you can say, yes, this is real, or this is valued, or this is any of those things. And it's not a bad thing. Like this doesn't say this is a bad thing, but when you think about the next step of generalizing that this is all human experience, it reveals a little bit of a flaw in our way of thinking about anything. Because anytime you can take something and generalize it out over a lot of people, whoever is not being actively represented in that moment is out of being real. They're not real. And so Hilma af Klint encountered that, I think, in the perspective of obviously womanhood at the time, in being a woman, being an artist, the major artistic movements were almost entirely, you can find one or two artists in these major formative movements of early modern art that are women. And so that obviously had a part to play with her experience, but think about how many other, that's just a start. There are so many different facets of voices that we don't listen to, or versions of real that we don't acknowledge or we don't see, because we've defined real as what's being delivered to us by the people that have the power to do that. And I think that's the really interesting part of this moment that we're in, and it's the part that is interested in me in the work that I do. I work with young people, with a team of people, some of whom are sitting here. We created a platform called The Wonderment and a community called The Wonderment that is basically connecting kids using technology, but also using grassroots community organizing and various methods to actually connect directly with each other. And the part that really motivates me in this is we are in a really amazing moment, which is, this is the first time in history that kids have equal access to information as adults do. And it's also the first time in history that kids have equal access to each other. So if you think about that, it's the first time that the biggest community in the world, so 18 and under is the biggest community in the world, can actually understand that they are a community, that they have a voice, that they have the ability to communicate that voice in meaningful ways that can do things, and that they have the tools and the vehicles to do that. And that, I don't think, it's another moment where it's like, I don't think we can overestimate how significant that is. We talk about like the singularity and the merging with technology and all these things that are like the buzzwords now of where the future of humanity is. And I think technology gives the access, but the thing that changes everything is the way that changes the way we perceive ourselves. And I think that kids are the place where that is happening in the most intensely shifting way right now. So I'm super motivated to work with them. And they are voices that have traditionally not been heard in that way. There's all kinds of phrases, children should be seen, not heard. I mean, there's all this decorum around and it's similar because it's a similar stuff that's been applied to women. It's basically, your voice isn't real because it's not my voice. And the whole transactional nature of that kills an entire field of insight that could be gained through curiosity. And that's really where the wonderment and the impetus behind that came, is what happens if we approach what's surreal or what's weird or what's new with a perspective of curiosity and inquiry rather than necessarily one of authority. But this is, so Joy mentioned a project that we have that we're doing right now with partnership with the Wonderment and some partners, some VR partners, Morph 3D being the biggest one. They're a local company that does a VR avatar engine that a bunch of different projects have used, Ready Player One and a bunch of other things. And they're really great people. And this last year, a few months ago, they brought together a summit up here in Park City, actually, and brought some of the most interesting people to talk about the idea of identity in a virtual world. What is identity? With all the ways that we can shift that using technology and using VR specifically, what does that start to mean about who we are, and how connected is that to our physical world, and what implications does that have for how we consider ourselves as a species? And so everyone from, there was Dave Eagleman, a neuroscientist who you probably wouldn't think to have at a VR conference, to Lisa Joy, who honestly, I was like, how does one person get to be so creative and so funny and like so beautiful all at the same time? It's like, it was a little ridiculous. And she was the one that helped create Westworld, which that's a very interesting storytelling device through which concepts of identity and concepts of technology are being addressed in an artistic and a creative way. But anyway, we're partnering with them and with the summit, the Virtual Identity Summit, to actually create a challenge that we're putting out to kids all over the world this year of what is something that you care about or you think could change that you could communicate through VR. And we're basically asking for ideas from audiences that don't have access to technology to develop it themselves, don't have necessarily maybe even interest in doing the specifics of the work themselves, but could be partnered with mentors and adults and facilitators who could help them translate their vision in a way that it could be shared with us. So basically the result of this partnership and the result of this challenge and this endeavor is going to be, we'll be representing stories from kids from places and from backgrounds that otherwise would really never be brought into that conversation. And when we bring people into the conversation, the people that were at this conference are the people that were doing the most interesting things with this technology on a social level. It's not just games. It's not just, I actually would say I went into this with a little bit of a bias against VR, because I kind of feel like the natural world and the world that we live in, the physical world and each other are interesting enough to, we ignore that all the time, so why do we want to put one more thing on our face? But I think that this whole experience has helped me shift to recognize that any technology is the desire to have access to some other way of looking at things. And then how you use that is a decision. And I think that that's one of the things that's been the most interesting about this project, is realizing that, that's possible. There's a little video that is going to be put out to schools and people who will be participating. Actually, no, we're going to skip that. So basically, coming back to the concept of surreal and kind of bringing it all together. I did not know this until this talk, which I love words and I love etymology. I love exploring where words came from, because I think that they're our species, our tool. That's the tool that we use better than any other species to generate cooperation on a global scale, which makes us a globally impacting force, for better or ill, but also gives really big importance, and we don't think about it. The words that we use all the time are impacting the way that we live our lives and how we define what's real. And I didn't even know that surreal didn't exist as a word until the 30s, and until surrealism, until the art movement. That's where it got its name. And that's a word that, there are some words that it's kind of like, you know, those ones that are like the trendy words of like, I don't know, that Heidi one or whatever, that like, the trendy word of the moment that's just like, I don't know. But surreal is a word we use all the time. Surreal is a word that I use constantly. And I just thought it was like part of the canon. I thought it was one that had been around forever, and it hasn't. And so it was really interesting doing a little bit of thinking and a little bit of reading into, I mean, I obviously knew surrealism as an art movement, but where that word and the power that that word had and the impact that it had on that unfolding, and in a positive and a negative way. So the first time it was used was actually Guillaume Apollinaire, who basically had this incredible experience at this ballet. And the way he saw what was happening made him realize he needed a different word than real. And he started using the word supernatural, and that's not it either. So he came up with this word, surreal, to represent this connection between what he was describing as the sets and the words and the ways that they were playing with your sense of what's real. It's such a sweet sentiment, and like this idea that it'll bring about changes in our arts and manners through universal joyfulness. I think that's such a beautiful sentiment, and kind of interesting to see essentially an art critic communicating at that time. But the thing that was really interesting about this is this word surreal came out, and it was just a zeitgeist moment. It represented something that people were starting to communicate in art. And I find it fascinating what happened next, which basically two factions decided, no, we get to say what surreal is, which is so ironic, because that's the whole point of it. Anyway, but the experience that they had was to, guys, thank you for being patient with me. So they created factions. They created surreal factions, which were like what artists were defining it one way, and what artists were defining it another way, and how that how that split amongst these lines, and how you then were back in the conversation of we're convincing each other of things. And the whole point was to break down what we're convinced and unify it in new ways, and find new ways that challenge what we see as being real. And so there were two manifestos, which kind of cracks me up. I feel like we go through a cycle of time every so often where it's like we go manifesto crazy and we just want to like say all the things and claim it and own it, and this is what we stand for. And ultimately, all this art was being created along, and Andre Breton, who was one of the faction leaders, he wanted to connect it a ton to social movements and revolution and Marxism and the different things, and like the political movements that were interesting to him at the time, the social revolutions. And this other group had a little bit different view of it. And it made me think about how quickly, when something bubbles up that is a little bit different than what maybe gets us to open up just a little bit, how quickly we want to shape it, control it, own it, and make it the new standard. And then beat everybody else. And I think that is the exact opposite, and this is the thing that cracks me up too. Surrealism was automatic writing, automatic painting, being open to the unconscious and the dreamlike state. And meanwhile, Hilma's over here, yeah, I did that 30 years ago. But I don't think she said that. I don't think she cared. But I think it's interesting that the people who were really open and the people who were really doing it got access to that way sooner in the process, and it's taken this much time for it to actually filter down to us and for us to be able to actually enjoy that. And it has such a power. So kind of wrapping up, the last thing that I did on this weekend, this kind of surreal weekend last weekend, it was in New York, and I went to this dinner, and it was a magic show. And I hate to say magic show because that makes it sound like cheesy or seedy or something. It was exactly the opposite of that. It was the classiest magic show I've ever been to. And you should go. It's called The Illusionist Table. Everyone should experience it. But I'm not even telling you anything about what he did, because I think you should actually experience it. But one of the things that I loved was he would do these things that would legitimately, my mind was blown. But the whole thing was, everything he did was pointing out that there are connections that we have to each other that we don't pay attention to or don't seem to have access to, that are in fact produce results that are magical. Like anyone at the table, your mind is blown. And he always took care to point back to, we're not paying attention to how everything is connected. We're not paying attention to how we're connected. And I love that because it gave me this vantage point that made me realize it's not about this external thing you can produce, although the external things you can produce, whether it's creatively, whether it's magically, are so much more augmented when you are living in this way of connection and openness. But those don't really matter in the end. I mean, as we saw with Hilma, she didn't ever get to see that. She didn't get to see the external manifestation of what it was that she was participating with. But the connection is the most real thing that we have. It's the only real thing we have, really, when it comes down to it. We think that the external is that, and it's not. And one of the things, I came home and I was telling my partner, John, about what had happened, and I didn't want to tell him too much because I wanted him to see it, but then I was like, I can't help it, I have to tell you all of it. And he is a very practical and pragmatic person, and was kind of trying to figure it out. He was trying to be like, well, of course there's something, and I'm like, no, it's crazy, it's magic. And it was interesting because our little boy was up in his room, and I didn't even think he was listening. And I've had this experience with kids a few times, and I always feel a little bit bad because I almost feel like I'm sending them home as an armed bomb of I'm going to tell kids magic's real, and that may bring up an interesting conversation with their parents. But I hear him up there, and he starts yelling. He's like, magic is real, and then he sort of keeps going. He's like, the Jedi are real, the Force is real, and he's just going off. I think it was his manifesto, but it made me realize, I was like, I'm not going to tell him yes or no. It's not my job to tell him I actually changed. I'm not going to tell kids magic is real. I'm going to ask them what that means to them. What does that mean to you? Because I think that that's the part that we shut down. We don't see where it's leading us. Because where it really is leading us, I really believe, is to the place where we're all connected. And it doesn't really matter what form that takes. It's whether we're willing to walk that path. And I think that that's the part that, as kids, when we lose that freeness to walk down that path, we lose something really crucial about our connection to ourselves, first and foremost, but then to the rest of each other. And I think that is where the factions and the manifestos come in, because we don't even know how to relate to each other. And we don't know how to form something that is real, that includes everyone, and that is actually fueled by the voices that share it rather than the ones that control it. And that, to me, this little journey of this last week, and knowing, it was funny, I found out I was going to do this a couple days before I left on that trip, and this whole thing has felt like I've kind of physically moved through the space of understanding this word in a way that I never had before and hadn't thought about it. And I hope that that's something in whatever work you do, whether it's with technology, whether it's with art, whether it's with creativity, whether it's with spreadsheets, whatever it is that you do, opening up to that idea that what you're doing is fundamentally connected to what everyone else is doing. And that if you ask questions, and if you're genuinely curious, and if you genuinely want to connect with others, that will yield the most satisfying results of the work that you're doing on any level. And I know it has for me, and that's why I was so excited to speak about this and so excited to be here with you. And thank you for being patient with the technical stuff and spending morning together. Thanks.